It's a great honour, ladies and gentlemen, to be asked to give the opening address of this wonderful conference. And for doing that, I want to just acknowledge, as I'm sure all of you will, the amazing work of Blanca and her colleagues in bringing this meeting together, the plans for which started well over a year ago, and we are now reaping the rewards of her efficiency. I also want to say that this is not my first visit to Belgrade. I was here 19 years ago in 2000, not on a musical agenda, but more on a political agenda connected to the war and the situation in the country at that time. And it's been such a delight to me to walk the streets of your beautiful city, see the buildings all beautifully restored, wonderful boulevards with cafes and people enjoying life here. So on at least a physical level, I congratulate you on restoring your beautiful city to its original glory. Of course, there are many more deep psychological things which perhaps are not yet completely healed, but anyway, we are here to talk about music, not that. So, for some 10 years now, I, with lots of colleagues, both inside and outside the Guildhall School, have been grappling with this overarching question. And the question is, what do audiences want from live concerts? And what opportunities and challenges does this present for classical musicians and the organizations they work in? Well, of course, it's an interesting question from a psychological point of view, but for the conservatoire world, at least particularly in the countries that I'm most familiar with, it's an important and even possibly an existential question. And the reason for that is because there has been an inexorable decline in public attendance at live classical events, now over some several decades. And I can show you some data from the National Endowments of the Arts, which conducted regular surveys asking the American population exactly the same question, which is, in the last year, which of the following cultural events have you attended? And the blue line is the attendance for classical music. In 1982, 13% of the population answered yes to the question, have you attended a classical music concert? By 2017, which is the date of the most recent survey, that number had dropped to 8%. And as you see, in every single survey cycle, the percentage of the population drops. And you cannot say, well, this is some general disaffection with live attendance in artistic venues. Maybe everybody is just watching it on YouTube or at home on the internet. No. Because the red line shows the comparable answer to the question about the attendance at art galleries. And what you can see is that percentage has stayed absolutely constant, and even in some periods has gone up. So about a quarter of the population go to an art gallery every year. So there's something afoot here. This decline is specific to classical music, opera and ballet. And data produced, comparable data produced in the UK shows exactly the same decline. And it's not only galleries that have stayed buoyant, but pop music is doing fine, theatre is doing fine, museums are doing fine. It's classical music that is suffering. And what we discover when we look more into the demographics in both these surveys, but also in data which concert halls collect about their audiences, is the major feature that is observable all over is the aging audience. In the 1980s, the average age of the audience for a classical concert, at least in Britain and the United States, was 35. Now it's getting towards 60. So young people in general are not going to classical concerts. And this is an existential problem because the survival of classical music as a profession, and therefore the survival of conservatoires which are training classical musicians, depends on an enthusiastic and growing audience for the product. So in order to try and get a handle on this and do some work which would actually try and address the fundamentals of this problem, I and my colleagues came up with 4 dimensions on which live artistic events or live attendance could vary, which might underlie some of the phenomena that we're seeing. And the 4 dimensions are established versus new repertoire, secondly, predictable versus unpredictable elements of what's being offered, thirdly, impersonal versus personal stance of the artist, and finally, passive versus active involvement or engagement of the audience. Let me just go through these in a little bit more detail so you really grasp how we're using these concepts. So by established work, we mean well-tried repertoire. And in the case of classical music, that usually means that the creator is dead. And this is the staple of symphony programs around the world. Some very interesting research done by a Spanish collaborator not so long ago showed that in an analysis of the programs of concert halls around Europe going back, I think some 50 years, Beethoven has never left position number 1, and Mozart follows shortly afterwards, and that's in every country. Whereas new means recent work, but also perhaps recently discovered work, unfamiliar work, work which is not very well known within a particular reception context. And it's generally by living creators. And as a generalization, you can say that other forms of live and visiting art do contain a higher proportion of new work than concert halls. It would be quite unusual to find a theatre which never did any new work. And even when, for example, we have the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, which only does Shakespeare by definition, but they make much about it new. The second dimension is predictable versus unpredictable. So by predictable, I mean that when you go into a particular kind of artistic event, you will know what's going to happen because the rules are very clear and they're fixed and they are similar from one event to the other. So for example, in most classical concerts, the program details will be fixed in advance, sometimes very, very long in advance, so that you know months ahead exactly what works you're going to hear. There are certain rules of etiquette about the way that performers and audience behave, so one concert can look very similar to another. By unpredictable, we mean things like flexible programming. For example, in most popular or jazz concerts, you go to see the artist. You have no idea what songs they're going to say, to produce. And maybe they don't even have much idea until a couple of days before the concert. And maybe they change their minds during the concert in relation to the audience reception, and so on. So that there are spontaneous elements. And in some other kinds of presentation, there would be more unconventional presentation, different ways of doing the staging, different ways of doing the lighting, arranging the performers on the stage, and so on. Clothing, many other features. Should I just pause while people find a seat? Fine, it looks as though most of the seats are now being filled. Great.
There's the young audience of the classical lecture.
Yes. Great. The third dimension is the dimension of impersonal versus personal. And by impersonal, we mean performers staying strictly within a quite restricted role, or restricted bodily and facial expressiveness maybe, and quite often limited audience performer interactions. In some of the research that we've come across, audiences talk about an invisible screen. It's almost as if they were seeing the performers behind a screen, because the performers never, as it were, step across to make direct contact with the audience. And this is quite true of a lot of classical performances, which are seen as quite stiff and unyielding. And you can compare that, for example, with a jazz performance. I'm a great jazz fan, and I'm absolutely delighted that this week is the home of the Belgrade Jazz Festival. I already went to a wonderful concert last night and hope to go to more. And players in jazz ensembles tend to talk to the audience, they tend to laugh, to smile with each other, and critically, they hang around in the bar during the interval and talk to the audience. They don't hide away in the green room like some classical performers. So I think you get the difference between impersonal and personal. And the final dimension is passive versus active as applied to the audience and the audience's role. And we find in classical music a very strong presumption that we are humble recipients in the presence of something great, maybe even something semi-divine, and our role is to be as still as possible, as silent as possible, and in a sense subject to the authority of the composer as mediated to you by the performers. Whereas an active role for an audience would be an audience that feels that they can do things. They can participate through movement. As I saw in the jazz concert last night, people were getting out of their seats, waving their hands around, vocalizing, clapping, all through the performance at moments when they thought that a performer was doing something particularly nice. And even, as I will come on to later, as co-performer. So those are what I mean by these dimensions of difference. And I think, by the way I've been describing this, you can already see that what I would be claiming is that classical music, when compared to other arts, is more established, more predictable, more impersonal, and more passive. And these are exactly the features of classical music that seem to be rather unattractive to young audiences. They experience, it's not the music that they find unattractive, it's the way the music is presented. So our scientific and artistic hypothesis and strategy, which has informed our work over the last 10 years, is that moving a performance along any of the four dimensions, towards the new, towards the unpredictable, towards the personal, or towards the active, will result in greater audience engagement. And the way we tackled this was to investigate through collaborative artist-scientist innovations in actual live performance situations. Now we've done a lot of work, and basically there's 9 strands to the work, which I put there on this slide in order of just temporal order. There's no particular logic to it. And I can't obviously talk about 9 projects. What I want to do is select 4 of those projects which illustrate or shed some light in particular on one of those 4 dimensions that I've been talking about. So let's head in. I'm just checking my timing, great. So let's look at this first dimension of established versus new. I've already mentioned that concert promoters tend to resist the new, and one of the reasons they resist the new is because they say our established regular audiences don't like it. They prefer what they know, what they like. So my co-investigators, Andrea Halpern, Daniel Mullensiefen, Chloe Chan and Julian Anderson decided to do a little bit of empirical work in this area. And our participating artists were the Guildhall School Contemporary Music Programme and the conductors Richard Benjerfield and James Weeks. And we have a paper, 2 papers in fact, which describe this work, and they are in the free online journal Participations, which is a journal of audience research, so you can download that without a fee. So as I say, the issue is that classical concert promoters and program makers seem still reluctant to introduce new music. Of course, this is a generalization. There are some promoters that specialize in it, but in general, on average, across the field, this is still true. Programs of major orchestras are very conservative, as I've mentioned. Beethoven and Mozart dominate. So one of the questions which arises when we are working with people who are putting on concerts is how can we perhaps help what are perceived as timid audiences to embrace the new, and then through that perhaps attract new constituencies who are more interested in something being produced now by a living composer than something produced 200 years ago by a dead one. And we noticed that one strategy or tactic available to any concert performer or musician is to repeat the same work twice. Why should that be interesting or useful for an audience? We know that spontaneous encores have long been a documented feature of live concerts. People love something, and so they won't let the performer go, and eventually the performer comes back and sometimes plays the same piece again. But to plan for a repetition in the program so that you know, and the audience knows, and the performers know in advance that the same piece is more rare. But it has happened. And it has mainly happened around new or unfamiliar work. Now, we know from other psychological studies using recorded music in the laboratory that if you repeatedly hear something, you come to like it more and understand it more. So maybe if you repeat a piece of new music twice in a concert, people will be more happy with it the second time, and therefore more likely to want to come and hear new music again. Some historical examples of repeat performance as a deliberate strategy. Stravinsky possibly is the most well-known case of this, and in his later life he actually insisted that if certain of his pieces, his shorter pieces, were to be performed at all, they must be performed twice. He actually formed the view that audiences needed to hear them twice to have any chance of getting to grips with them. And when he died, Robert Kraft, who had conducted many of his works while he was alive, continued with that injunction, and so was always performing these pieces twice. In more recent times, the recently late composer-conductor Oliver Knussen, who died, I think, earlier this year, included repeats of works by Elliott Carter, Stravinsky, Webern. Very famous case when he played the 5 orchestral pieces twice in a concert by the London Sinfonietta, and a reviewer who wrote in one of our national newspapers didn't even notice the fact. And more contemporarily, the UK has a new music biennial. Every 2 years it has a festival of new music, and the format for their programs is that each new piece is performed twice, separated by a discussion between the composer, some of the performers, maybe a critic, maybe a music theorist, and then the piece is listened to again by everyone. And that's the concert. The concert is just that one piece performed twice with a discussion in between. However, in all of these cases that we've looked at, there has never been any formal assessment of the impact of this on the audience. Of course, there have been anecdotes and speculations and post-concert chats with your friends, but that doesn't quite, is not quite the same as doing it systematically. So that's what we did. We asked audience members to rate each piece they heard on a 7-point scale after each performance of it. The design was a bit more complex, and I'm not going to go into all the bits and pieces of the design, but sometimes the 2 repetitions were next to each other, sometimes they were separated by other pieces, sometimes the audience knew in advance that there were going to be repetitions, sometimes they didn't. But all of that made very little difference to the overall result, so we don't have to go into that in too much detail. But the 4 statements that they were asked to rate, 2 were effective: I enjoyed the piece, I would like to hear the piece again in the near future, and 2 were cognitive. I felt I understood the piece, If I played some excerpt from the piece tomorrow, I'm confident I'd be able to recognize them. And there, in a nutshell, are the basic results. The blue bars are liking of the piece on first and second hearing, and the red bars are understanding. Both went up statistically significantly, but the understanding increased particularly much between first and second hearing. So, playing a piece twice is a way to woo your audience into a new piece that they've not heard. So that's one way of helping audiences become more familiar and comfortable with a new piece. But there are other ways that you can do it through what we've described as opening up the artistic process to greater audience involvement. What do we mean by that? Well, there are many ways it can be done. But the way that we did it was with a particular chamber orchestra based in the UK called Britten Sinfonia. And this was something devised with my colleagues Helena Gaunt, John Rink and Karen Wise to look at audience performer engagements, interactions over a series of events in a concert season. I'm just going to describe one part of that now, because it was again a quite complex, multifaceted study. One of the concerts had an open rehearsal attached to it. An open rehearsal on the day of the concert in the afternoon. And audience members were invited to not only come to the concert, but to sit in on the open rehearsal. The programme contained new works, including a world premiere, and the reactions to the experience were probed by questionnaire. And a particular focus I want to concentrate on today is how attendance at the rehearsal had affected the concert experience, not least because in the rehearsal they had heard the pieces once, and then they would hear them again in the concert. So here are some of the aspects. There were three main themes in quite free, open responses to a series of questions. Orientation, connecting with the process, and connecting with the people. I'll just give a couple of examples of each. So one sub-theme in orientation is familiarity and recognition. You somehow get more involved in the piece, in the concert, because you have heard it already. Here's a quote. Both rehearsal and discussion help towards enjoyment of the concert as growing familiarity breeds enjoyment. Or, having been in the rehearsal, it was wonderful to have those moments of recognition in the concert. So there's a real kind of emotional buzz of, we've got to that moment. There was another sub-theme, which was about audience members feeling part of a journey or included in a journey. So here's a quote. Having listened to the rehearsals behind the scenes, I felt more connected in some way. Even if they were rehearsing snippets, I felt more involved. I loved hearing them discuss and talk about the process that went towards this concert. I enjoyed it more having listened to the process, and I felt like I was part of the journey. And this leads really to another sub-theme, which is seeing artists as fallible and human. The traditional concert presentation, the impersonal concert presentation, tends to make audiences believe that the artist is kind of perfect and untouchable. So here's a nice quote from one audience member. I found the rehearsal interesting. It made the performers seem more human in the sense of fallible and subject to variation and imperfection. This made the occasion of the concert feel more unique and special. And in fact, I felt more empathy with the performers, with them being less like untouchable, perfect gods. And because of that, got more involved with the whole event. I think this is very profound. I think there's a strong pressure in the whole way that we train as musicians to presume that perfection is what an audience wants. This kind of data shows that actually audiences want something else. They want to be exposed to your humanity, which is something different. So, for a musician, let the audience closer to you. Let them see your mistakes. Let them see your problems. Don't just present the perfect end product. And of course that involves taking risks. And sometimes our training and the whole culture in which we grow up makes us want to be very risk averse, and maybe this is one of the reasons why there's so much music performance anxiety and stage fright in our profession. Now, the risk-taking that was in this study we have just talked about was opening up the audience to your rehearsal process so that so the audience can see something which isn't quite finished. But perhaps the ultimate risk is to open up that in the concert itself. And one way in which you can open up yourself to risks, as it were, on the concert stage, is through improvisation. When that kind of risk is exposed to an audience, it can be even more compelling. So this takes me into the next dimension, which I want to briefly illustrate in terms of the work we've done: predictable versus unpredictable. Now, of course, when you hear a performance of a particular well-known work by two different performers, the performances are different, they're subtly different, and one of the reasons for going back again and again to different performances of the same work is precisely to feed on those differences. But that's a quite restricted kind of difference in musical history. And there's now a lot of very, very well-attested historical research that particularly in the classical period, the period of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and extended further into the middle of the 19th century, improvisation was at the core of artistic practice. And Mozart, for example, would have been horrified if a performer had taken one of his piano concertos or something and just played it note by note what was written down. In Mozart's mind, the score was an invitation, a blueprint around which a performer could embellish and make their own performance. That practice has almost completely disappeared in the late 19th century and early 20th century, but musicians are now rediscovering this tradition in the spirit of historical authenticity and are bringing these improvisatory traditions back to the classical repertoire. And one of the people who's leading on this, certainly in Europe, if not in the world, is my colleague David Dolan at Guildhall, who heads the Centre for Classical Improvisation. In this particular study, we also had collaborators from Imperial College, Henrik Gjeldhoff Jensen, Miguel Molina Serrana, Pedro Mediano, Hardik Rapau, and Fernando Rosas. And our collaborating artists were graduates of the Guildhall, Rosalie Bowker, Kate Smith, and Thibaut Charin. And there is a paper which has come out of this work. Well, there are several papers, but the most recent one is in Frontiers in Psychology. And again, it is completely free for full download. So the research design, we had an invited chamber concert by a professional trio of flute, voice, and piano in the motion lab of the Data Science Centre at Imperial College London. And the reason for being in there is that both musicians and audiences could be monitored and wired up in rather interesting ways that are not available in the average concert hall. And a number of short works were each played twice. Once in what you might call normal prepared mode. I'm still expressive, but the expression was prepared, and the musicians call that strict. And once in the improvisatory mode, which they call let go, in which they embellish the notes sometimes, but also they spontaneously add interpretation marks, changes in speed, changes in loudness, changes in articulation, but not predetermined. And the remarkable thing is, of course, doing it as a trio, because then you're constantly having to respond to other people. It's much easier if you're just doing it by yourself. The work that we studied most intensively was the opening andantino section of Schubert's Der Ritt auf dem Felsen, Shepherd on the Rock, Opus 129. This is a complex study, and I invite you to go and read all of it if you're interested. Again, I can only just dip into one particular aspect of it, which were post-performance ratings by audience members. And there was a separate rating after each piece. They did not know which was improvised and which was, as it were, strict. They were simply told, you are going to hear two performances of the same piece, and we want you to rate each performance. And the dimensions on which they rated are given there at the bottom of the slide. Improvisatory character, innovative in approach, emotionally engaging, musically convincing, and risk-taking. And here are the mean ratings for the entire audience. The blue bar are the strict or prepared interpretations, and the red is the improvised. So you would expect anybody familiar with Schubert's style to know that the improvised performance was improvisatory indeed, and maybe innovative, because you wouldn't have heard it exactly like that before. But interestingly, listeners also found that performance more emotionally compelling and more musical, and again, obviously, risk-taking, so there's a validation there. We were able to test various possible confounding variables. The improvisatory advantage is not significantly affected by whether or not the audience sees the performers. Half the audience were behind a screen, so they couldn't see the performers. That proves that the effect is mediated by sound alone. And that's important because in an earlier study, we discovered that the musicians were much freer in their bodily movements and also in their facial expressions during the improvised performance. And it might have been the visual cues which triggered the audience response. Not so. It's entirely the sound which causes these differences in responses. It also turned out not to matter whether or not the audience member is musically trained. We had half musicians and half non-musicians in the audience, and they responded identically, or at least not significantly different. So this is a means of engaging, getting more strong responses from audiences. Was it just verbal? No, it actually also showed itself in brain responses. So on some members of the audience and also on the performers, we used an EEG analysis. This is not my area of expertise, so if you ask me questions about it, I'm going to have to say, well, ask my colleagues at Imperial. But the measure was called the Lempel-Ziv complexity, and there's a whole research literature out there about why this is an appropriate and reliable measure of alertness. Monitored at 19 scalp locations, and neural signals split into 2-second segments for calculation. And I'm just going to present the overall result, which is on the graph on the right here, which is that the brain alertness for the improvised performance was considerably higher, and that significantly higher, and that was true for both performers and for audience members. Now, all the interventions that we've talked about so far have kept the audience out of the creative process as observers. The final study I want to talk about looks at what happens if you actually invite audience members in as co-performers. And so this really addresses the fourth of the dimensions that we've been talking about. And just checking my timing, very good. Which is passive versus active. And so this is a study called The Audience as Artist, which involves contemporary music expressly written for audience participation, with parts for the audience to perform. My co-investigator here was Jutta Töhle from the Max Planck Institute of Empirical Aesthetics in Frankfurt, and our artistic collaborators were two composers, Juan Rao and Christian Mason, and four contemporary music ensembles based in Europe: the London Sinfonietta, Ensemble Modern Frankfurt, Asker Schoenberg, Amsterdam. There was also a fourth ensemble in Portugal, whose data in the end we couldn't include for technical reasons. And again, there is an output from that research, quite recent output in ESCOM's very own journal, Musicae CNTI. I think electronically available, but not yet in paper. Am I right, Jane?
Yes.
Yes. The funding for this project came from a Swiss foundation called Art Mentor. And the aim of it was to observe the impact of pieces composed with parts written for the audience to play instruments, make sounds, and move also. This is not a completely new initiative. There have been composers in the past who've written pieces for audience engagement. Xenakis, Mache, Williamson, Ferrari, Cargill, Cage, Schnebel, Anderson, Cardew, to name but a few. But as far as we're aware, in none of these cases was any systematic data collection ever undertaken on the audience members and how this actually went down with audiences. So, I mean, these were generally compositions which in a sense were determined by the artist's own sense of what, in most cases, he wanted to do, without any particular reference to whether the audience wanted to do it. In this particular case, the publicly advertised rationale for the whole project, and this is from a press release, is to inspire composers to experiment with the idea of shared curation, encourage musicians to lead public participation, and empower audiences to play their own role in great art. So there were two compositions in the concerts, a piece by Christian Mason and a piece by Handel Roll. Both were world premieres, and this was taken around 4 cities in Europe. Slightly different. It's concert hall setups in the 4 cities, so there had to be quite a lot of adaptation by the performers in each of the contexts. The performance took place under guidance, and the guidance was visual and sonic cues. So there were people standing at the front of the audience making certain signals, prearranged signals, which told audience members what to do, and also there were signals from the percussion section. So the percussionists had a huge array of percussion instruments, and audience were told, you know, whenever the percussionist hits the gong, do this, or whatever. So that was the kind of conditionality which was set up. In one case, audience members were given snippets of poetry and were invited to read them out rather than mutter them under their breaths. There were gongs, there were bells, there were harmonicas, different sections of the audience had different things to do. There were some rehearsals, optional rehearsals, which people could attend before the day. I think about just one. But also, when the audience was assembled in the room, there were warm-ups going through some of the routines again. And there was a questionnaire immediately after the event. I wasn't physically present except at the London Sinfonietta concert in Westminster. And I was really, really quite impressed by the dedication which audience members gave to the task of filling in these questionnaires. There were still people writing heavily half an hour after the concert had ended. So clearly they had a lot to say. Over the 3 venues researched, there were 638 attendees at these concerts, 50 of them attending preparatory workshops, and 273, that was 43%, stayed behind to fill in the questionnaire. And I want to just look very briefly at some of the qualitative measures that came out of that. This was, again, open response, so people were asked very general questions. What was the best thing about the performance for you? What, if anything, did you not like or find difficult about the performance? What did you enjoy about the workshop for those who attended? Was there anything about the workshop you didn't enjoy? And there was also some open. Is there anything else you wanted to say? This yielded rich qualities of data which Jutta was responsible for analysing, and she extracted 4 main themes from the data, which are there on the slide: special group experience, interactive musical experience, experience of shifting power relationships, and evaluation of the participatory situation, in other words, how did it change anything. So on the special group experience, there were sub-themes of community and immersivity. So one respondent said sharing the experience with composer, performer, audience, the sense of us all being together in this rather than 2 separate camps. Immersivity. Musicians around the room made it feel like we were in the piece. The way that it was, as it were, choreographed is that musicians were around the outside of the audience, and the audience were, in a sense, encased with sound. The second theme was the theme of interactive musical experience, and that had 2 sub-themes. One was being aware of the musical process. So, for example, seeing how the music came together through rehearsal, and also the theme of accessibility of the music. Participating gave me a greater appreciation of the structure behind the 2 pieces. Shifting power relationships. The quotes I gave up to now are quite positive, and that characterised the general flavour. But under shifting power relationships, there were more ambiguous or negative comments. So one participant said, childlike participation in the Mason. And kind of backing that up, someone else said, I think the audience could have managed a bigger, more complex part. This would have avoided the cameo sensation. And several audience members felt as if they were not really being treated as artistic equals. They were being given very simple, rather trivial things to do, which kind of helped to create the atmosphere, but all the really interesting and important stuff was kept by the professional musicians. And another audience member said it did feel more like an experiment than a performance, which was rather weird as an audience member. So finding what's your role, what's your real place in this experience was difficult for some. The final theme of evaluation. Well, many people found quite interesting meaning or implications in this. One participant was inspired by this poetry that was to the hand, to say, it was wonderful to engage with poetry again. It inspired me to read some poetry to my hospitalized mother. Very unexpected outcome. And another person raised the issue of attention. It actually helped them pay more attention to what was going on. Participating made me watch and listen closely, more than I usually do. My minor role in this was to help add some quantitative measures in. Scales. I enjoyed this piece. I got a clear sense of how this piece is put together. I feel the performance was well done, and I understand what the audience's role is on 7-point scales. And, well, all one can say, really, is that there were uniformly high responses on all these scales. There was not a huge amount of difference according to different contexts or different demographics. There was a ceiling effect. So, at least to the quantitative questions, people liked this. So, this is the first extensive data that is out there on audience reactions to a participatory composition. There was a high level of engagement in the research, and a variety of benefits of taking part were mentioned. Particularly, it appears to heighten appropriate attentiveness and connection to the musicians and to each other. And in some way it validates the uniqueness of the live concert experience. You can't get this on YouTube. However, participation by some was felt to be tokenistic and too elementary, thus condescending. So the capacities of the audience members are very important to take into account, and they weren't. Some felt that concentrating on what to do and when distracted from the overall aesthetic experience and would have preferred just to listen. I have to say, I found myself in this boat. And after attempting to be a participant in the first performance, I went and sat at the back and just listened to the second. And I think I wasn't completely alone. So what comes out of that is there is this urge for participation. People think that all participation is somehow good. But perhaps the way to take participation forward is to engage with people on a different footing, not as audience members, but as actual performers, co-creators from the beginning. And this is a direction in which my research and the research of colleagues has now gone. And I want, with your indulgence, to just move in that new direction at the end of my talk, and also to introduce to you a new scholarly association which, as it were, supports work like this. We would call this work socially engaged music practice, and that may mean slightly different things to different people. But we can notice as a phenomenon in many countries that the decline in traditional audiences, plus changes in the way that governments decide to fund artistic work, have led to some music organisations increasing what are sometimes called outreach programs, which are programs outside the concert hall, more in the community. And increasingly, some musicians don't see this outreach work as second best, something to fill the gap between real concerts, but they are beginning to see this kind of work as their primary mission. In other words, in their musical work, they want to do social as well as musical good. So here is one example of a project in the UK, which has been going for some years with apparently great success, both artistically and socially. It's called Streetwise Opera, and it's an opera that engages homeless people, not as audience members, but as actual performers and creators, alongside professional musicians. There are a lot of projects around the world bringing participatory music into settings such as old people's homes, and so on and so forth. But what is this socially engaged practice? Well, it tends to be professionally trained musicians acting as facilitators and guides to people in the community, people who may have little or no actual formal musical training. It tends to be working with people where they are, not demanding that they come to a strange and rather expensive-looking concert hall far from where they live. The participants in these projects are very often defined by their social needs. That's how, as it were, the intervention is targeted. And the collaborative activities which are crafted result in both artistic outcomes, in other words, a performance, a creation, which can be shown and shared to others, but also social outcomes, that the people involved in this are changed, or their groups or their societies are changed in some way. It's a rapidly growing area. Practice exists at every level, probably involving now hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. And the projects range from very high profile, large and long-term projects, such as the El Sistema project, which began in Venezuela and has now been franchised all over the world to many countries. That's the one extreme. But the other extreme is that there are a lot of projects which just involve a musician or one or two musicians who have discovered a niche that they want to occupy and specialize in, working with smaller groups of people, perhaps for more limited periods. Now, this practice is mushrooming. It's everywhere. And what we've discovered is that it's leapt far ahead of the research on it. And one of the dangers of this work is that musicians and people who fund this work are pressured into making extravagant claims about the social benefit. And very often those extravagant claims are not based on really sound evidence. They're rather based on anecdote and pushing forward of the best spectacular cases, of which, of course, in any project there will be some. So, in 2017, a new scholarly society was formally born. And this is the SIM, that is Social Impact of Making Music, platform for research. It has a website, and there it is. I'll leave this slide on for a little bit so you can write it down if you want. And I encourage you to go and look at it. But let me tell you what it is and what it does. Its aims are to support the development of and dissemination of scholarly research into the use of music in social work and socially oriented projects. And the way we do that, I say we because I happen to be president of SIM at the moment, so I have to declare an interest here. The aim is specifically to hold conferences and seminars and to support and, where possible, sponsor specific research projects and research training initiatives. So what it does in particular is it brings researchers together to advance the field through, first of all, connecting researchers to each other and connecting them to developments in research, but also to connect researchers to practitioners who are doing this work, who are interested in engaging more closely with research, to support and stimulate research training initiatives. At the moment we're focusing mainly on doctoral and postdoctoral levels. And as such it functions as a scholarly society, but also perhaps a little bit more as a change agent, working to make this new field stronger and more visible. And here are our next events. We have an annual symposium, which very much like the event we're in now, there will be a call for submissions, and anyone is free to submit, and then there will be a program of presentations, and there will also be the possibility for non-presenters to attend and listen. That will take place in Brussels on the 24th and 25th of July next year, and a call for submissions will appear shortly. But we also have a research seminar, which is a longer event, lasts for most of a working week, where we bring primarily doctoral students together with a small cadre of experienced facilitators to go in much more depth into research issues and research questions and helping students develop their research projects. The organizer of that is Grasa Bol-Eros, who I think is here. Has she arrived yet? Well, she'll be here shortly. And a call for participants for that will appear sometime next year. And now, in the time remaining to me, yes, I've still got 5 or so minutes. Brief time. A lot of time. Oh, okay. Is to talk a little bit about the field itself. And this draws on a presentation I actually made at the 4th symposium earlier this year, which was held in Bogota, Colombia, where a huge amount of this kind of work is taking place, and there's a real burgeoning research effort around it. So it was great to be with our friends in Latin America. As I said, it's a new area, and what research exists is scattered over many outlets. But in the 3 symposia and the 1 seminar that we've held so far since 2017, we have probably collected together the largest concentration of publicly presented work that we have, because people had to present submit abstracts, and the abstracts are available. So there were 112 project-specific abstracts that have been accepted. And I decided simply as a short research project to systematically examine those 112 abstracts to see what they could tell us about what our emerging field looks like. And one of the things you can immediately look at is what countries are the researchers who do this work in. That may be a function of where the conferences so far have been held. One was in London, one was in Portugal, and the third was in Colombia. But there is a concentration of researchers from the UK and Colombia so far, but it also may represent the strength of the field in those countries. So 50% of the contributors were from 4 countries, UK, Colombia, Spain, and the USA. But some of that was because people from another country had come to these countries to do their PhDs, and their fieldwork was actually back in their home country. So if you ask the question, what countries do the researchers study? It's a larger group of countries, it's 34. Although still 50% of the researchers in 5 countries, Brazil, Colombia, UK, Portugal, and the USA. And there are some countries which projects are being researched on, but there's no researchers so far identified in those countries, as it were, to connect to for the research. So it's being done from outside. I won't read out all those countries, but it's interesting that is a model. In other words, it's showing that social projects are very often being done in areas of the world where various kinds of capacities are not fully developed, and that's why the projects are being done there. It's part of a development impetus. The second question I was asked is, what kind of social impact is actually being discussed? What are we talking about here? What is it that people doing this work are intending to achieve? So I looked at all the words and phrases describing social impact, and they were taken verbatim from the abstract of each proposal or presentation. And because quite a lot of the abstracts were in Spanish, I'm afraid I had to resort to Google Translate for the Spanish abstracts. These were then clustered into related groups, and some tentative group titles were proposed. I'm not going to dwell very long on this, but the bullets in each of these slides are actual words or phrases used by people in their abstracts. And the heading at the top is my kind of clustering of what these are all about. So the first cluster is to do with social inclusion. The second cluster is to do with social justice. And you can see things there like women's rights and stigma reduction. The third cluster is to do with cultural visibility, and this is about preservation of local cultures at risk, the protection of cultural heritage, also overcoming of cultural stereotypes. There was a section on peace and reconciliation. By the way, the numbers after a particular word or phrase are the number of times that word or phrase was used across the body of the abstracts as a whole. That's telling me my time's almost up. So, peace building. 5 abstracts out of the 112 explicitly talks about peace building as a name. That's what those numbers are there for. Memory of war, nation building. Collaboration was the next heading, including intercultural harmony, community engagement, solidarity. Empowerment is another cluster. Improved confidence, agency, risk-taking. Self-development is another cluster. Self-expression, self-esteem, hope. Identity. Strength and identity, national identity. Professional identity. Trust. Creation of attachments, bonding, interdependency. Violence reduction. Health, not so many in health. Health is a bit of a separate field. I mean, there are lots of cross-links, and that's, I don't know, the debates we're going to have in the field. But by and large, this group of people we've drawn together around this society are not working in health contexts. And a whole range of one-offs, which I couldn't quite classify anywhere. So what do we make of all of this? Well, that's a lot of headings. Can we put it into some kind of a framework? So this is my first really tentative go at making some kind of sense of it. So the target of the intervention could be a group, or it could be an individual. So if we're talking about violence reduction, I think we are actually talking about making individuals less violent. But also the direction of the impact can go, as it were, inwards into the personal, into the group, or it can be an impact that group is then empowered to have outwards. So it seems to me that cultural visibility is a group impact, but that group impact is outwards. It's making that group more visible to the people outside that group. So that gives some kind of framework in which we can perhaps begin to think about different types of intervention being more or less suitable for different ones of these outcomes. And as you can see, it is a very complex framework in Jigsaw, and we're only just at the beginning of trying to figure it all out. But there's not only that set of data, there's also a set of data about the target constituencies, which turns out to be equally varied. So words or phrases describing constituents were taken verbatim from the abstract of each proposal again, and were clustered into related groups. So we have groups defined by occupational and study status, school children, training music teachers, healthcare professionals. Groups defined by the kind of music they're performing, so a particular orchestra or an after-school youth music project or a communitarian choir. Groups defined by health status. Very interesting, so that although there were not many health interventions, there were quite a lot of groups defined by some kind of health status in order to improve their social position. So, for example, people with HIV, blind people, etc. Groups in or emerging from conflict, very significant clustering. Refugees, ex-combatants, survivors of war, etc. Displaced and homeless was another strong group, including immigration detainees, prison inmates, who in a sense, by definition, are homeless. Marginalised and geographically defined groups, for example, indigenous people, non-dominant cultural and linguistic groups, etc. Groups defined socio-economically, young people in challenging circumstances, women, poor postcodes, again, a huge variety. Age-defined groups, young people, elderly people, young people at risk of exclusion. And so again, in terms of classification, there were some groups defined by what they do, occupational groups, for example, groups defined by what they have suffered or experienced, for example, people suffering with particular health conditions or emerging from conflict, and groups defined by what or where they are, so marginalised, geographically defined, with particular socio-economic status, etc. So what does all this lead to? Well, many countries are involved 3 years into the existence of that platform, but many are still not, including Serbia. So the question is, has the platform reached all the countries where there has been equal activity, and if not, how do we do it? And that's one of the questions I throw to you. Many kinds of social impact have been named in the presentations. Can the research field move towards a more useful typology which would assist in determination of suitable research methods in each case? And many constituencies are recipients of these projects. So we have a challenge here about how we can encompass this breadth in generalization or research conclusions. And now to bring it back to the original question, which is what do performing musicians do and how the conservatoires respond to all of this? Well, pessimistically, because this decline has now been going on for nigh on 50 years, maybe audiences for classical concerts, for live classical concerts, will never recover. But we have to look to a future where fewer people will be going to classical concerts than they have been in the past. Therefore, maybe musicians need to be trained for new careers. Not that we abandon the other career, of course that's always going to be there, but that there is an alternative, and a valued alternative, which is that they are trained as facilitators of participatory music making with non-musicians. And this work can, and in many cases does, still demand the highest artistry. It's not a second best artistically. And conservatoires are, in many countries, and maybe also in this country, struggling to demonstrate to the population and to their governments the social relevance of the work that goes on within their doors. And this could be a very easy and real way of making that case for state and societal support. And what's the role of research in all of this? Well, I see one of the important things that research is a preventative against overplaying. Because everybody involved in this work has got huge pressures on to overpay. Political and funding pressures that lead to the search for success stories and the burying of failure. But actually, only through analysis of failure can the field learn. So we have to create a culture in which imperfection is also allowed, just as we were talking earlier about imperfection being valued by audiences as a way to engage them with musicians as human beings. So imperfection in our social projects is actually a way of showing each other that we are learning and learning from our mistakes as well as our successes. Because if you only have successes, you will never learn anything. So I see research as an important contributor to the development of better practice and better pedagogy to support that practice. Why are conservatoires, or some conservatoires, interested in this research? Because they want to put on new kinds of pedagogy to better equip musicians for doing this kind of work. Being able to play the violin or the piano superbly does not equip you with the skills to know what to do when you are faced with a group of traumatized refugees after they don't speak your language. Playing the violin better will not help you. Thank you. I think we have time for questions, and I'm going to ask Blanca to help me if there's a sea of hands to select appropriately. So, questions, I think, or comments? We're going to see if we can manage this without a microphone, but it means people at the back will need to speak loudly. Oh, you have a microphone? Okay. Perfect.
Thank you, John. That was a really interesting keynote. I suppose I just have a general question about what we were speaking about at the end, that it's a good idea to train musicians to be facilitators of this important social work. But I think in doing at, what can we do to ensure that musicians are also being compensated appropriately for doing this kind of important work. What we see in music therapy is that they're, doing this really valuable social contribution, but we don't value it in a way that we value other therapeutic work like psychiatry, psychology. So what can we do as a society to value it?
I think it's a very important question, and it's a question I feel a little bit ill-equipped to answer. But it may well be that in 3 years' time, if you ask me that question, I'll have a better handle on it, because a group of colleagues and myself have been very fortunate to win a quite large grant for a project which will start next year, to actually look at musicians' experience of doing this work around the world. And that will include their working conditions and the framework in which they're doing the work, as well as their hopes and fears for it. And I think, I mean, you cannot predict what the results are going to show in advance of doing the research, but I would be very surprised if we didn't come across some people who are doing this for really inadequate compensation, just because they care so much about the work.
Okay, I'll try to shout also. Well, I was wondering about your research on making audience more active. I'm just wondering about your intuition about it. Well, I was looking into it. I was thinking that the wrong direction might be that they were trying, or you, to make the audience become a performer. Like when you go to a jazz concert, it doesn't look like including the audience to become the performer, just to make them to be more active audience. Do you?
Exactly. I wanted to choose this particular piece of research with Jutta primarily because in some way I feel it might be a bit of a gimmick and a bit of a dead end. But anyway, it's the first time that there's been a substantial amount of audience data on it. Yeah, I completely agree with you that possibly the way forward is actually to go back, again, a couple of centuries and take the best of what audiences were like back then. I think it would be fair to say that a primary reason of going to a concert, perhaps in the 18th century, was because it was a place where you could see who else was, who was wearing the latest dress, and it was a social event, and the music was a kind of an excuse to interact. In fact, the very first concert hall which was ever built, which I think, if I'm right, was in Leipzig, was actually built as a concert hall rather than a church being adapted or something, or a court of some rich person. The audience seats faced each other, like choir stalls in a cathedral. So you had a bank of audience and another bank of audience looking at each other. And the musicians were down the side, because the musicians were not allowed to obstruct the view of the audience members of each other. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go back to that kind of contempt for the performing musician, but I think we do need better mechanisms of allowing audience members to feel part of a crowd which has, in a sense, got agency, and that the way that that crowd behaves can inspire more and more and better out of the musicians. I had a really wake-up call. I'm a jazz fan, I go to a lot of jazz, and some of the jazz that's being performed is performed in very, very small rooms, where you can literally only seat 30 or 40 people, and you're almost, the sweat from the players is coming onto you because they're so close. During the interval, one of the players came up to me and said, "You'll still be here in the second half, won't you?" And I said, "Well, of course." And he said, "But you didn't look as though you were enjoying it." And I was actually, I don't know, worrying about something at work or something not to do with the performance. And that performer noticed it and was affected by it. And that told me that actually I have a lot of power as an audience member to determine how the event goes. And so I think if we just find smart ways of waking audiences up and saying, hey, you matter, how you are, if you're looking at the players in the eye or not, that can hugely affect how well the players do. I don't know whether that's an answer, but I completely agree with you. there's much more to be done.
Oh, thank you, because I can take up your question and your point. John, how is any research that's been done comparing the experiences of musicians and audiences, the same programs in the round, as in music in the rounds, Crucible Studio, or for that matter, at the New Vic in Newcastle under Lyme, and the same programs given in, for example, the Guildhall Hall or larger venues?
It's a very interesting question. I think I don't know of any research. And just to make sure everybody understands what is meant by music in the round, it's where the audience surround the performers who are in the middle, and therefore audience members are indeed facing each other across the musicians and are able to make eye contact and observe more what's going on. There are some very, very interesting studies, a little bit tangential to this, by a colleague at Queen Mary, whose name is Patrick Healy, where he looks at what impact an audience member reacting has on their neighbours. So if an audience member laughs, what's going on with the people right next to that person? And he was particularly investigating in the context of stand-up comedy, which is a quite interesting and sometimes intrusive art form, where the comedian will suddenly pick on an audience member and very gently humiliate them or embarrass them or something. And when that happens, the visible shrinking of the people on either side of the target or the victim, is empirically measurable. So there are all these things which do go on between audience members, which we could research more.
I just want to ask, you have proof all of these methods are effective, but don't you think that the biggest problem is that the society of classical musicians has too many prejudices towards making improvisations and giving liberty to performers? So I think, if you organize a concert that has improvisation and liberty, most of the critics and people in the circles of classical music won't accept that kind of performance. Which I don't agree with, of course.
Yeah. It would be very interesting if I had my colleague David Dolan here to tell you about what a struggle it is to get concert halls, concert promoters and recording agencies to accept that an improvised version of a familiar classical work would sell. And there's a lot of vested interest in keeping this out, because the vast majority of contemporary musicians don't do this kind of thing. So yes, there does need to be a cultural change, and the question is, where is that cultural change best led from? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't necessarily think that conservatoires putting on improvisation courses will necessarily get to the root of the problem if those graduates can't get work because no concert hall will risk putting that kind of work on. So it is a really interesting question, and it's a question, I suppose, of social analysis of the entire scene, at both policy, organisational, pedagogic, and individual musician level, and asking the question, who has the most influence to be able to change things? And I'm afraid that isn't my expertise as a psychologist. It would be wonderful if someone could do that kind of organogram of the contemporary performance scene to see where those potentials lie. And there is another thing which I could say, and it's what I thought you were going to ask, which is, of course, the level of practical awareness of what it is to make music has changed very radically, at least in countries like Britain. In the 50s and the 60s, when I was a child, most young people had some structured music performance experience on which to base an appreciation of others doing it. And that was because there was much more free music education available then in the schools. Everybody could learn a musical instrument. But it was also because there were social institutions which made it possible for people in any town, in any village, to do music at different levels. And one of those was churches. Every child, when I was growing up, were sent to church by their parents, even if their parents didn't go themselves. And there you learn to sing. And that doesn't happen now. So there are all these complicated things going on. It's a multi-dimensional, and I don't think anybody could claim, oh well, if you add this to a concert, it's going to solve the problem. It's not necessarily.
Now, this is more like a comment than really a question. I have sort of a caveat, or at least some reserves concerning this idea of audience as performer. Now, since I'm, among other things, a composer, you know, a composer's perspective is sometimes really not crazy. Godlike feeling, I'm creating something, I don't have control over it. So, bad enough that I have to entrust it to professional performance, let alone audience participating in that. So I don't think it will really work very well with many composers.
I agree. You've said it in a nutshell.
I'd like to use the back of, you can hear me. I'd like to thank you for emphasizing this shift for the purpose of social aspects of our getting together for this conference, actually shift from perfection and doing endless rehearsals so to make premiere or final performance as perfect as it could be, and being so, as you put it, strict and very formal in the situation, because any distractors, varying behavior or even dress or performance can jeopardize that perfection. And I love it because without that shift towards imperfection and shifting towards process instead of final product and so on. This is a kind of continuing question with the colleague before about improvisation, but from another aspect actually. But do you think it is going to have a frustrating impact on the profession itself, since you elaborated some competencies needed to interact with and sounding almost like a modern interactive teacher, since we know that not only in the musical professions, but there is a saying like those who cannot do, they teach, and you want them now to do both and to recognize this, how to say, proper performance by those who are not professional, let alone children, since we have a problem in our schools, for example, that some visual art teachers, all of them actually, they do let children draw and paint, but no music teachers, maybe colleagues from musical schools will be against what I'm saying, but my experience is, wouldn't there, except some very elementary involvement, wouldn't dare to let children perform, let alone to compose or improvise or so on. But again, I'm so happy that you put the imperfection, because there is no inclusion, they can't be included without introducing parallelly with perfect finished products, something that is in progress. Thank you.
Thank you. Two quick comments to that. One is that there is a very strong model of what a music performance, a live music performance is, which comes, I think, from the Paris Conservatoire model. And at the top is the composer. the inviolate composer who has created a masterwork. Then next down is the performer, whose job is to faithfully, as it were, project that composer into an audience. And at the bottom of the hierarchy is the audience, whose job is to shut up and feed on the benefit. I think that what I was hinting at is that this is a new model of the audience. It's only been around for 150 years or so. The much more long-standing model is that the audience is the reality. That what matters is that the audience goes away filled with something. And therefore, the audience's requirements come first. The performer is there to serve the audience, and they serve them by carefully selecting compositions which they will present to the audience. So it turns the hierarchy on its head. Of course, you need compositions, but this is a different privileging. The second question is about, will this be seen as second-class or second-rate work? Well, I have to perform an anecdote here in the absence of the research which we're about to do. But in Guildhall School, where I work, a group of undergraduates who were doing really well on the traditional track of learning elite performance kind of got together and said, this isn't actually good enough. This doesn't meet our ethical and social responsibilities. We're going to go to the Brazilian rainforests and work with poor people in Brazilian villages to bring music and drama to them. So they formed themselves into a group, raised money privately, and off they went, with no help or even awareness of the staff in the Guildhall. Once the staff did realise that they were doing it and how well they were doing it, of course they immediately claimed this as a result of the Guildhall training. But I think it perhaps is more a result of enlightened selection policies which have interesting students on the campus. And now that project is a flagship project which is getting major funding, and they're reproducing this program all around the world. The professors had nothing to do with it. So I think that gives us hope that young musicians see the state of the world, they see their peers not getting jobs in symphony orchestras because of the declining market, and they just say, we've got to do something else. And they're going to just vote with their feet and do it, regardless of what their professors say. So that's my hope.